Sergeant Everett read, Chandler didn't expect to live through sunrise. The jungle below him was already shaking, not from artillery, but from footsteps. Hundreds of them. A rolling human storm rushing uphill through mist and broken palms, bayonets raised like silver fangs in the half-light. The Japanese didn't attack quietly. They announced death, screaming, Tenno Haika Banzai, until the sound felt like a physical force, rattling the chest and gut more than the ears. Chandler's men were exhausted, some bleeding, some nearly deaf from gunfire. The machine guns were glowing hot, and every rifle barrel felt like it would melt in the next volley. Retreat meant massacre. Holding meant being swallowed whole. And the Japanese believed this ridge was already theirs. Doctrine promised that once the spirit of the charge broke a line, the Americans would crumble like sand. But Chandler didn't order a fallback. He ordered something the manuals didn't teach. Something so reckless that junior officers froze in disbelief before obeying it. He told his mortar crews to fire straight down the hill, nearly point blank. A weapon meant for soft arcs and distant targets was about to be turned into a close-range storm of steel. The 60mm mortars howled, then slammed into the charging wave. Not behind it, not near it, inside it. The jungle didn't just explode, it came apart. The unstoppable charge stumbled, then fractured, then died. And in that moment, an entire myth, the myth of the invincible Banzai charge, cracked in half. The Japanese believed courage alone could break steel. But courage had never met mathematics, not like this. Before that ridge ever turned into a furnace of mortar fire, American infantry had already learned something dark about fighting the Imperial Japanese Army. They were not facing men who valued survival. They were facing soldiers trained to treat death as a weapon and to deliver it up close. The first time U.S. troops saw a Banzai charge, they didn't understand what they were hearing. It wasn't like the scattered shouts of European battlefields. It was a rolling, rising roar, a scream that didn't pause for breath, like a storm pulling oxygen out of the world. Reports from Guadalcanal said the sound came before the soldiers appeared, like thunder outrunning lightning. One Marine wrote in his field diary, it was like the jungle itself was screaming and the ground wanted to run. The Japanese commanders believed something no Western doctrine had ever truly embraced, that shock itself was a weapon, more devastating than lead and steel. If they broke your mind, your line would break next. And if the line broke, the battle was already won. To American eyes, the attacks looked suicidal. But to them, it wasn't suicide, it was obedience to a worldview. The Bushido Code had been reshaped for the 20th century into something far harsher than its medieval ancestor. The soldier was not a man, he was a vessel. The body was expendable. The emperor was eternal. Death was not the price of service, it was proof of loyalty. Captured manuals would later reveal a chilling phrase repeated in officer training. A soldier's value is demonstrated at the moment he chooses death willingly. How do you outfight that? How do you intimidate men who believe the act of dying is their victory? American units who weren't ready for that answer often didn't get a second chance to learn it. Many first encounters followed the same grim pattern. A night attack, sudden screaming, bodies coming through smoke and brush, bayonets flashing like wet mirrors in moonlight. Not waves, collisions. Men punching through sound and terror before bullets could cut them down. Rifles slowed them. Machine guns tore gaps. But they kept advancing long enough for the psychological blow to land. They did not fear you. And fearlessness, when weaponized, is contagious. A foxhole wasn't just overrun, it was invaded. A man wasn't just shot. He was engaged, face to face, blade to barrel, breath to breath. One private wrote, after surviving a charge on Matanacar Ridge, that didn't come to win. They came to erase us. And for a time, it worked. The shocking thing wasn't that the Japanese charged. It was how often they almost succeeded. They wanted proximity, not distance. Where American firepower mattered least, Japanese doctrine hit hardest. 6 feet away, not 60 yards. Commanders came to dread the phrase that started circulating through foxholes. If they reached the wire, we're already losing. And that terror only grew when men learned the truth. many attackers weren't expected to return. They weren't fighting for survival. They were fighting through annihilation. What breaks a man who isn't afraid of dying? That question haunted commanders more than any bullet. And the atmosphere of dread was magnified by something else: silence before the storm. Japanese units could move ghost-like through terrain that swallowed Americans whole. They learned to read jungle angles like a second alphabet. They could crawl through brush with knives in their teeth and never crack a twig. By the time a defender heard them, the screaming had already begun. The psychological fuse was already lit. Some historians later called Banzai tactics primitive or desperate. That is hindsight. In the moment, they were brutally effective. They weren't meant to win battles mathematically. They were meant to win spiritually, to make the enemy feel defeated before logistics or firepower could matter. And for soldiers unprepared for that shock, it worked. One wounded corporal later said, "You don't remember the charge. You remember the moment you knew it wasn't stopping." And here lay the great flaw in American thinking during those early months. They kept looking for a breaking point in the attackers. They assumed exhaustion would stop them, or casualties, or the moment their leaders fell. But Banzai doctrine cut out all three assumptions. Each man was trained to be his own last commander. There was no collapse threshold. There was only impact. The U.S. needed not just firepower, it needed a psychological countertactic. Something that didn't merely kill the wave, but broke it instantaneously before the emotional blow could land. But what could do that? Machine guns slowed the mass, but they didn't shock it. Rifles dropped men, but the ones behind stepped over them. Hand grenades were too small, artillery too delayed, perimeter traps too unpredictable. There was no weapon that combined speed, blast radius, and raw disruption at exactly the moment the human wave reached full momentum. Until, strictly by accident, someone fired a mortar closer than doctrine allowed. At first, it wasn't innovation, it was panic. A desperate shot. A last-second mistake that became a revelation. In those seconds, something clicked, the very thing that made Banzai fearsome. Massed bodies in tight formation made them catastrophically vulnerable to near-field fragmentation. Not 50 yards out. Not 30. 10. The Japanese weren't prepared for that because their doctrine had never imagined it. They feared artillery. They feared naval guns. They feared airstrikes. But a light infantry mortar, one they had dismissed in their own manuals as tactically insignificant, that wasn't just a blind spot. It was the crack that Chandler, and men like him, would eventually drive a hammer through. Because once Banzai lost inevitability, it lost mystique. And once mystique collapsed, fear could run in the other direction. The only question left was, could this improvised idea become a rule? Not a one-time miracle? And who would be the first commander to gamble his entire line on it, intentionally, knowing there would be no second chance if it failed? That answer would come soon, on a ridge lit not by sunrise, but by exploding mortar shells. Before it became the nightmare of every Banzai assault, the 60mm mortar was almost an afterthought in American doctrine, a platoon tool, not a battle changer. An accessory, something tucked behind the line, carried by the unlucky pair of soldiers assigned to haul its awkward steel tube through mud and vines. If you asked a 1942 infantryman which weapons would win battles, he'd point to machine guns, artillery, tanks, not the stubby knee-high mortar that looked more like camping equipment than salvation. Even the manuals treated it like a support prop. Smoke cover, harassment fire, illumination. Never a deciding weapon. Never the thing that breaks the enemy's will. But in the jungle, where artillery couldn't always see, where tanks couldn't always go, and where distance collapsed into choking foliage and sudden ambushes, the mortar had something the bigger weapons lacked: immediacy. It could fire now, at this tree line, at that ravine, into those footsteps closing fast. No radio delay. No coordinates. Just a glance, a range guess, and thunder. The irony is almost cruel. The Japanese underestimated the 60mm mortar because the Americans underestimated it first. In captured training papers from the Imperial Army, U.S. gear was cataloged by psychological threat. Browning machine guns? High threat. Mortar? Low lethality. Their officers believed the blast radius was too small to matter in dense jungle fighting. They saw it as a mosquito sting, not a hammer. Something that annoyed, not destroyed. That miscalculation would later become fatal. Because the real secret of the 60mm mortar wasn't its blast radius. It was its range of terror. Most armies think in distance. But fear? Fear lives in proximity. A bayonet kills at arm's reach. A bullet at dozens of yards. But a mortar shell? It destroys whatever it touches and whatever stands next to it. And it does it instantly, without warning, without time for ritual or spirit. Most men never even saw the shell that killed them. Before the innovation, mortar crews were drilled by rote. Set base plate, fix angle, adjust elevation, lob shells over the line, safe, predictable, doctrinal. High arc controlled math. No surprises. But Banzai wasn't slow arc. It wasn't distance killing. It was momentum. And momentum needed something that didn't wait for calculation. It needed something that could turn the very moment a wave reached its psychological peak into the instant of its destruction. The first mortar crews who broke doctrine didn't do it to innovate. They did it because they were out of time. One radio man later said, remembering that first near point-blank shot, it wasn't strategy. It was instinct. We didn't think, will it work? We thought if it doesn't, we're dead in 6 seconds. Improvisation bred insight. When those rounds detonated close, too close, the effect was different from the distant thumps troops were used to. These blasts didn't disrupt position, they erased momentum. The sound wasn't a boom. It was a concussion, a gut punch of pressure, and shrapnel exploding outward like a steel hurricane. Bodies fell not one by one like under rifle fire, but in clusters. The formation shattered. And suddenly, something psychological flipped. The charge visibly stopped being unstoppable. That was the first crack. But a battlefield miracle only becomes doctrine when someone recognizes it not as luck, but as leverage. The next challenge was trust. Soldiers might improvise under panic, but commanders must authorize repeating it. And at first, leadership resisted. On paper, firing mortars nearly flat was reckless. Dangerous. A wild shot that risked hitting friendly lines. Some officers even reprimanded early crews for doing it. But then something inconvenient happened. Frontline reports began to line up. Different units. Different islands. Same pattern. The closer the mortar shell landed, the faster the charge collapsed. And word spread. Quietly. Whisper to whisper. Not through doctrine. Through survival. Mortar crews began training each other unofficially at night, out of sight of formal review. They marked ground distances with boot lengths. They memorized angles not from manuals, but from instinct. This far, this dip, this tilt. They learned by feel, the way a blacksmith feels steel temperature by its glow. Veterans started saying the same sentence in after-action reports. The moment we dropped it close, they broke. Meanwhile, Japanese intelligence kept assuming the wrong thing. That American lines held because of artillery discipline, because of logistics, because of supply superiority. They never realized that a small weapon was rewriting the psychological rules of the battlefield. They were searching for strength in the wrong direction. And so, the doctrine gap widened, quietly, invisibly, until Chandler's Ridge would make it impossible to ignore. But before that day, there was another revelation. Mortar crews realized something else, something far more devastating than raw blast power. The 60mm didn't just kill. It distorted time. Men charging forward at full adrenaline suddenly had no continuation. No split second left to finish courage before death. No final strike. A man can die bravely if he sees his enemy. But dying to something unseen, sudden, faceless, instantaneous, shredded the myth of sacred death. The weapon didn't just tear bodies. It tore ritual. And once ritual breaks, morale follows. That was the moment the mortar became more than a tool. It became a counter-myth, one that didn't care about honor or spirit or spectacle. It cared only about physics, fragmentation, and finality. And the Japanese had no doctrine for a weapon that killed courage before it landed. But the question still hung in the air. waiting for the man willing to bet an entire line on this unorthodox tactic. Who would be the first to deliberately use mortars as a frontline shield instead of rear support? Who would look at the manual and throw it away? That answer, the first intentional test, was coming, and it would explode like thunder. By the time Chandler's platoon reached that ridge, the idea of close mortar fire was still battlefield rumor, a ghost tactic whispered between survivors, not something approved, not something written, not something any colonel would salute. Most men knew about it the way soldiers know about miracles, as a story told by someone who swears they saw it once. But rumor isn't doctrine until necessity becomes louder than orders. The turning point came during a night assault when the jungle itself felt alive with movement. The Americans could hear the Japanese assembling, not just scattered footsteps, but a mass, a sound like a human avalanche coiling in darkness. The veterans recognized it instantly. There's a weight to silence before a Banzai charge, a thickness, a sense that the air itself is bracing for impact. The first screams cut through that silence like a blade. The line shook as always. Rifle bolts slammed forward. Machine guns barked. The jungle lit with muzzle flashes. The air tasted like burning cordite. For a moment, it looked like every other desperate defense. Hold long enough to pray for reinforcements. But this wave didn't slow. They came through gunfire like a tide, ignoring rocks, sprinting through tracer fire, closing the distance by sheer will. Several Japanese soldiers were already within grenade range. The next seconds would decide everything. Most commanders would have ordered fallback lines. But the sergeant in charge that night, not Chandler yet, another before him, saw something else. He saw compression. The wave had bunched tight to force breakthrough. Not spread, not scattered, condensed. Dozens of men inside a single blast envelope. He didn't think of doctrine. He didn't think of safety. He thought of physics. He shouted the order no manual contained. Drop it close. A mortar crew turned shocked. How close? The answer came like a verdict. On the slope, now. The first shell left the tube before the loader even breathed again. It traveled barely a second before detonating. The men at the line didn't just hear the blast. They felt it, the way a body feels thunder through bone. A shockwave ripped outward and vaporized the charge's front rank. The scream of Banzai cut off mid-throat. The wave stumbled, not metaphorically, literally. Feet caught bodies. Men tripped over the fallen. Momentum shattered. The second round landed deeper, and panic ignited. The Japanese had never trained to face sudden fragmentation at point-blank range. There was no spiritual preparation for being erased before the mind could complete its act of devotion. Bushido promised a glorious collision with the enemy. The mortar denied collision itself. They weren't dying in battle. They were simply disappearing. That distinction mattered. Honor collapses where spectacle cannot exist. When the wave broke, the mortar team realized something chilling. They hadn't just killed the attackers. They had crushed the rhythm of Banzai. And Banzai without rhythm is just sprinting men with knives. After-action witnesses described the scene with the same phrase. It was like thunder landed on top of them. Word spread quickly. But this time, not as rumor, as testimony. Commanders started to ask questions. Could this be repeated? Could it be refined? Could it become more than desperation? Could it become strategy? But there was a problem. To turn it into a tactic meant defying the manual openly. It meant choosing risk. It meant betting the lives of an entire perimeter on a blast landing feet, not yards from friendly lines. Who would sign their name to that decision? Who would gamble career for survival? Chandler would. But before he did, the mortar crews themselves had to answer another realization. Close blast fire wasn't just a new tactic, it came with a terrifying cost. If the Japanese ever learned the trick, if they ever anticipated it, they could adapt. Every miracle carries a deadline. The clock was ticking. Worse, the Japanese felt the shift before they understood it. Survivors of broken charges began reporting confusion. The Americans killed us before we reached them. We fell without striking. There was no contact. To the Bushido mindset, this was not a tactical failure. It was a spiritual insult. And insult breeds escalation. Japanese officers began pushing waves even harder, even faster, trying to strike before the blast could land. The charges grew more reckless. The range shortened. The collision drew nearer, which meant the margin for error shrank to seconds. The next time the tactic was used, it wouldn't be improvisation. It would be deliberate, authorized, planned. And Chandler would be the first to command it with full awareness of what it meant. No fallback. No second line. No time to adjust. If the blast failed, death walked through the wire. It was the closest thing a platoon commander could call a battlefield execution or salvation coin toss. And that coin was about to hit the dirt on a ridge that should have fallen in minutes, but didn't. Because Chandler was not just fighting bodies. He was fighting the idea of inevitability. And the only way to kill inevitability is to interrupt it before the moment of impact. The ridge would become a crucible, the place where myth collided with physics head-on. And history would remember not the moment the first wave charged, but the moment the second wave never reached the line at all. The ridge was supposed to fall in minutes. By Japanese planning maps, it was already captured in spirit before the first man even charged. Their doctrine said that a Banzai assault didn't win at the point of the blade. It won the moment the enemy believed the blade could not be stopped. Chandler's platoon wasn't defending earth and trees. They were defending the psychological doorway to collapse. And that morning, collapse seemed inevitable. The Japanese came in formations the Americans had never seen so tightly packed before, shoulder to shoulder, shoulder to conviction. Officers carried swords raised high. Not symbolism, but signal. Press forward, no break, no hesitation. The screaming rolled up the hill like a physical wind. Chandler's men said later they felt it in their ribs before they heard it in their ears. Everything about the moment said, this is where the line snaps. The gunners opened fire first, stitching arcs of tracer through brush. The attackers stumbled, but didn't slow. Riflemen fired until their bolts stuck and their hands shook. Still they came. The first grenades lobbed forward. Still they came. In the old calculus of war, that should have been step 2 of collapse. Chandler saw something others might have missed, not bravery, but pattern. He knew the wave was no longer a collection of men. It was a single organism, hunger tied to momentum. If that momentum reached the wire, nothing human could stop it, unless something inhuman did. He shouted the order before fear could interrupt courage. Bring the tubes forward. Mortar crews blinked, stunned. They were already close. Chandler wanted closer. Past doctrine. Past comfort. Past everything the manual considered sane. To obey meant gambling their own lives. They dragged the tubes up beside rifle positions. No levashchanark. No hyperabola. Just steel angled like a fist aimed down the throat of fate. The loader hesitated, not from fear, but from disbelief. Range, he asked. Chandler didn't answer with numbers. He answered with urgency. We don't miss today. The first round thumped into the tube. The screaming wave reached its fever pitch. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then detonation. Not in front of the charge. Not between lines. Inside the wave itself. The blast didn't interrupt momentum. It ripped momentum apart. The charge didn't drift or recoil. It collapsed, folding inward like a struck drum. Fragmentation ate through ranks in an instant, shredding cohesion. 1 second, an unstoppable mass. The next, pieces. The second round landed yards deeper, and the wave lost shape. Survivors stumbled, slipped, collided. The rhythm, the ritual, was broken. There was no glorious death, no final surge of spirit. There was only erasure. What made Banzai terrifying wasn't numbers. It was inevitability. But inevitability needs an audience. When a mortar turned the wave into chaos, inevitability died in front of witnesses. The third round struck before the shock could become recovery. Then something happened American troops would talk about for months, stunned even as they described it. The attackers stopped screaming. Banzai without the roar was no longer a storm. It was just terrified men in open ground. Some Japanese soldiers tried to push forward alone, but without the wave behind them, there was nothing to carry their courage forward. Bushido doctrine had prepared them for dying together in momentum. It had not prepared them for dying alone in failure. The ridge did not break. The wave did. Inside the Imperial Officer Corps, this should have been unthinkable. The charge was not merely a tactic, it was identity, discipline, faith. To fail was not defeat, it was theology unraveling. Intelligence intercepts later showed shock spreading through command like a wound. Officers struggled to explain how a mere platoon, shattered a spearhead that should have swallowed it whole. They reported unexpected fragmentation fire, with a tone somewhere between confusion and disbelief. It wasn't artillery. It wasn't armor. It wasn't superiority of number. It was a weapon they had already discounted as irrelevant. The humiliation was more than tactical. It was doctrinal. Bushido taught, strike before fear can live. But the mortar taught its inversion. Kill the strike before belief can bloom. And Chandler knew, in the smoking stillness after the third blast, that this ridge was no miracle. It was a proof. Banzai wasn't invincible. It had a seam, a fracture point. From that day on, mortar crews would never again be background support. They would become frontline fulcrum, small tubes with outsized consequences. The Japanese had believed the Americans feared the charge. After Chandler, it was the charge that learned to fear the mortar. But another question was already forming, a quieter, colder one that would hang in the air long after the bodies cooled. Once a myth is broken, how does an army built on myth continue fighting? That answer would shape the psychological war that followed, and rewrite what morale meant for the rest of the Pacific Campaign. Because the ridge wasn't just a battlefield. It was a funeral for an idea. When the smoke cleared from Chandler's Ridge, it looked like one more brutal scene in a brutal war. But history rarely announces its turning points with banners. Sometimes it hides them in moments no journalist saw, no general witnessed, no press desk ever typed, a quiet pivot disguised as survival. The 60mm mortar didn't become famous that morning. It became inevitable, because the mortar hadn't just killed bodies. It had killed a worldview. Japanese strategy wasn't built on technology parity. It was built on belief, on the conviction that courage could close any gap, overcome any weapon, drown any line through speed and faith and shock. But a weapon that struck before the moment of contact severed the ritual of courage itself. Bushido promised transcendence in collision. The mortar erased the collision. You cannot die nobly when you never reach your enemy. From that point forward, Banzai charges no longer frighten men the same way. A myth is only terrifying while it is untouchable. Once it bleeds, it becomes human. Once it fails twice, it becomes solvable. And once soldiers believe a thing is solvable, panic reverses polarity. The Japanese weren't the only army using indoctrination. Every army does in its way. The difference was that theirs leaned on the human heart. The last place war allows fragility. American adaptation leaned on numbers, angles, and velocity, the cold precision of physics. One side trusted spirit. The other side learned spirit is powerful until shrapnel does not care. Troops began training with new confidence. Mortar spotting became second nature. Platoons no longer fixed mortars behind lines. They married them to the front, sitting almost inside foxholes, aimed like a coiled fist. Firing solutions were no longer abstract arcs. They were this tree line, that ravine, that sound. The mortar became a door slammer, the final word in momentum. Even commanders who once dismissed mortars as light assets began requesting them first. Not for harassment, not for smoke cover, but to kill inevitability before it could bloom. The psychological tide had turned, and the Japanese felt it. Not all at once, not in a conference room or an intercepted message. They felt it in the battlefield silence where screaming used to live. They felt it in hesitation, a half-second pause that never existed before. They felt it when younger soldiers glanced sideways after the first blast instead of forward. The wave that once roared now stuttered. Spirit cannot outrun doubt, because courage is a flame, and the mortar was a wind. The most brutal irony is that Japan had once prided itself on battlefield innovation during earlier wars. But a rigid system punishes change. Tradition became a cage, and doctrine became stone. The United States, fighting not for honor culture, but survival under fire, evolved mid-battle. They learned forward, adapted forward, improvised forward. War rewards adaptation, not ancestry. And Chandler's Ridge became a case study in a lesson as old as warfare. The first side to abandon myth wins. Some later historians try to paint this as a story of technology, a simple, better weapon answered by weaker doctrine. But that strips the humanity away from why it mattered. This wasn't about a tube and a shell. It was about the death of inevitability. On that ridge, the Americans didn't just hold ground. They stole certainty from the enemy. Once certainty dies, morale rots. Once morale rots, ritual becomes burden, not inspiration. And once ritual becomes burden, soldiers stop charging as a wave and start running as individuals. Bushido had no script for dying alone, no glory in evaporation. Many Japanese officers later wrote, sometimes bitterly, that the spirit of the charge met a curtain of thunder. But thunder isn't just noise. Thunder tells the world, a storm already landed. And by the time that lesson reached Tokyo, it was too late to rewrite doctrine, too late to retrain formations, too late to replace faith with flexibility. A small-caliber mortar had done what no speech, no propaganda counter, no American broadcast could ever do. It convinced a charging army that they could be stopped before they reached purpose. And when purpose dies, so does fury. The war would continue, island to island, trench to jungle, mud to volcanic rock. But from that moment on, the Banzai charge was no longer a spear. It was a gamble, and gamblers bleed faster than armies. In military museums today, the 60mm mortar doesn't look like a myth breaker. It looks plain, functional, modest. But history is rarely rewritten by what looks powerful. It is rewritten by what interrupts power when it matters. The Ridge did not become legend because of its size. It became legend because of its pivot. The instant one army realized its doctrine was not immortal, and the other realized its adaptation was. Because in war, the deadliest weapon is not always the largest. Sometimes it's the one the enemy never believed could change anything. And on that ridge, a small mortar did something enormous. It killed inevitability. Some weapons win ground. Others rewrite belief. Chandler's Ridge was where fear changed direction, and history followed. If you want more forgotten moments where invisible turning points reshaped entire wars, stay close. Because the next story isn't about holding a line. It's about breaking destiny itself.